in the vast, untamed territory of Manhattan, where empires of steel and glass rise like mesas against the sky. This is a tale not of dust and gold, but of ambition and honor. It is the story of a king who believed his concrete kingdom was the whole world, and the woman he cast out, who was forced to find her strength in the wilderness of heartbreak. This is a fable of two different kinds of power, the kind you take and the kind you build, reminding us that the truest legacy is not one of blood, but one of choice. The chandeliers of the Metamorphosis Gala dripped light like molten gold, bathing the grand ballroom in a soft, forgiving glow. From the velvet-roped perimeter, it was a beautiful sight, a swirling river of silks, jewels, and bespoke suits. But from the inside, where Elara Sterling stood, it felt more like a watering hole at dusk, where the most dangerous predators of the city gathered to display their power, their smiles hiding sharp teeth. Her hand, as it had so often these last few months, rested on the gentle, protective curve of her belly, a silent promise to the new life nestled within. It was her anchor in this glittering, treacherous sea. Across the room, she watched her husband, Julian Croft. Even now, after all the subtle shifts and chilling distances that had crept between them, her heart gave a familiar, traitorous flutter. She remembered the man she had fallen in love with 5 years ago. He hadn't been a king then, but a young wolf with a fire in his eyes, a hunger to conquer the world that had both thrilled and frightened her. He came from nothing, a past he never spoke of, and he wore his ambition like armor. It was that raw, untamed energy her father, Arthur Sterling, had seen and decided to champion. "He has a hunger in him, Ellie," Arthur had said, his voice a warm memory. "That kind of fire can build cities or burn them down. The trick is to give it something worthy to build." Her father had given Julian everything: his mentorship, his capital, and finally, his complete trust in the form of his only daughter. And for a while, the fire had built. Julian had transformed her father's solid, honorable company into a global empire, a kingdom of concrete and code. He had become a king. But somewhere along the way, the man she loved, the man who would read poetry to her by the fire in their first small apartment, had been subsumed by the monarch he'd become. Tonight, he was in his element, moving through the crowd with a fluid, predatory grace. His smile, which had once been meant only for her, was now a carefully calibrated weapon, charming investors and disarming rivals. He was talking with Conrad Beaumont, a telecom magnate whose business practices were as brutal as a frontier land grab. And beside them, listening with an unnerving stillness, was his daughter, Serafina. Serafina Beaumont was not merely beautiful, she was a statement. Sculpted from ice and diamonds, her posture was perfect, her expression a mask of cool appraisal. She was, Elara realized with a sudden, painful clarity, the perfect queen for Julian's new kingdom. Serafina's world was one of strategic mergers and ruthless acquisitions. She understood the language of power, of dynasty. Elara, who spoke the language of the heart, of legacy and love, felt suddenly as if she was speaking in a forgotten tongue. When Serafina laughed, a low, throaty sound, and placed a delicate hand on Julian's arm, it wasn't a flirtation. It was an alliance being sealed in plain sight. The familiar, cold knot of unease tightened in Elara's chest. It was a feeling woven from 100 tiny betrayals. The late nights he dismissed as closing a deal, the hushed phone calls that ended the moment she walked into the room, the faint, alien scent of gardenias on his suit jackets. Each time, he had looked at her with those impossibly blue eyes and offered a plausible explanation. And each time, she had chosen to believe him. She had chosen love over doubt, focusing instead on the nursery taking shape in their stark penthouse, a soft, warm haven of hope she was building against the encroaching cold. Her gaze drifted, seeking escape, and found a figure standing alone by the tall French doors that led to the terrace. He stood apart from the swirling currents of the room, a pillar of shadow in the golden light. Silas Thorne. In the mythology of Wall Street, he was the Lone Rider, the phantom who had appeared out of the western territories of Silicon Valley 5 years ago, with no past and an uncanny instinct for the kill. His rivalry with Julian was the stuff of legend. Julian built empires through charisma and connection. Silas Thorne simply took them, his efficiency a brutal force of nature. He wasn't performing for the crowd, he was simply watching, his gaze a sweeping, analytical searchlight that seemed to pierce the polished veneers of everyone present. He exuded a quiet, dangerous stillness, a stark contrast to Julian's restless energy. For a breathtaking moment, his dark eyes met hers across the expanse of the ballroom. There was no social pleasantry in his look, no artifice. There was only a flicker of something raw and unnervingly perceptive. It wasn't just recognition. It was an acknowledgement of her situation, as if he could see the gilded bars of her cage and the storm clouds gathering just beyond her perfect horizon. There was a surprising, unwelcome flash of what felt like pity in his gaze, but it was the pity of a seasoned veteran for a settler who has no idea the war has already reached their doorstep. A shiver traced its way down her spine. Elara tore her eyes away, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked back toward her husband, the handsome king of this glittering world, who was now smiling at Serafina Beaumont. And for the first time, Elara Sterling allowed herself to feel the chilling, terrifying truth. The fire her father had warned her about was no longer building. It was preparing to burn her world to the ground. The ride home in the back of the silent, gliding town car was its own form of torture. The city lights, once a shared symbol of their kingdom, now blurred into streaks of cold, indifferent color against the tinted windows. Elara sat beside Julian, the physical space between them no more than a few inches, yet the emotional chasm felt as vast and dark as a canyon at midnight. She could feel the unspoken words hanging in the air, heavy and sharp. She replayed the scene at the gala in her mind, the way Serafina Beaumont had looked at Julian, not with adoration, but with the cool respect of one monarch for another. It was a look of mutual recognition, of shared destiny. Elara's heart ached with the desire to demand an explanation, to scream her fears into the crushing silence, but she was paralyzed by the terror of the answer. She knew, with the kind of deep, instinctual certainty that precedes a natural disaster, that to ask the question would be to invite the hurricane into her home. So she said nothing, her silence a fragile prayer against the inevitable. Julian, for his part, was preternaturally calm. He stared out the window, his handsome profile etched against the passing city, looking not like a man returning home to his pregnant wife, but like a general surveying the battlefield after a decisive victory. When they arrived at the penthouse, the silence followed them, amplified by the cavernous, minimalist rooms. The space, with its cold marble floors and vast expanses of glass, had always felt more like a corporate headquarters than a home. It was a testament to Julian's success, a gilded cage designed to impress, not to nurture. Tonight, it felt like a tomb. Julian methodically loosened his tie, the silk whispering through his fingers. He walked to the floor-to-ceiling windows, his back to her, a solitary king gazing out at his domain. The city sprawled below them, a glittering carpet of light and power. His power. "The Beaumont deal is going to be massive, Ellie," he said, his voice the calm, measured tone he used with his board of directors. "It's more than a merger. It's a refounding. It will make us untouchable." Us. The word was a cruel ghost. She remembered him whispering it to her years ago, when all they had was a tiny apartment and a shared dream. Then it had meant them against the world. Now, she understood with sickening clarity that it meant him and his ambition. "That's wonderful, Julian," she replied, her voice barely a whisper, a sound swallowed by the sheer scale of the room. He didn't turn. "I need you to understand what's at stake. This isn't just about wealth anymore. This is about legacy, the kind of power that lasts for generations. It requires absolute commitment, a level of focus that leaves no room for distractions." The final, devastating blow was not delivered in the cold grandeur of their living room, but in the one place Ilara had carved out as a sanctuary. She had retreated to the nursery, a room of soft blues and creams, her hand resting on the smooth, polished wood of the crib her father had given them. It was a room filled with promises, with the scent of hope. Julian followed her, his presence a jarring intrusion. He stood in the doorway, his custom-tailored suit a slash of dark grey against the room's gentle innocence. He didn't seem to see the hand-painted mural of a serene forest or the tiny clothes she had so lovingly arranged. He only saw the final obstacle on his path. All of this, he said, his gesture encompassing the room, her belly. "It's a complication I can no longer afford." "And a complication?" Ilara's voice was a faint, breathless whisper. Her heart felt as if it had stopped. "Julian, this is our son's room. This is our baby." He finally turned to look at her fully, and the charming mask of the man she loved was gone. In his place was a stranger, a king who had decided to annex new territory and was now dispassionately eliminating all prior claims. His eyes, once the color of a summer sky, were now as cold and grey as the storm gathering over the city. "I'm leaving you, Ilara." The words were spoken so calmly, so devoid of emotion, that they seemed to bend the air around them. She stared at him, her mind refusing to process the statement. She waited for the punchline, for the cruel, twisted joke to end, for his face to break into a smile and tell her he was just testing her. But his expression remained a mask of grim finality. "What did you say?" "I'm leaving you," he repeated, clipping each word with brutal, surgical precision. "My life is moving in a different direction, and you are no longer a part of it. I've filed for divorce." The strength drained from her legs, and she gripped the changing table to keep from collapsing. The room began to swim. "It's her, isn't it?" she whispered, the name tasting like poison and ash. Serafina Beaumont. He didn't deny it. He didn't have the grace to look ashamed. He simply inclined his head, a gesture of confirmation. "Serafina understands what it takes to build a dynasty. Her father has made me a full partner. Our marriage will consolidate 2 empires." He spoke of it not as an act of love or betrayal, but as a strategic maneuver, the most logical move on the chessboard. "A dynasty?" she choked out, the tears she'd held back for so long finally blurring her vision. "What about the family we were building? What about your son?" His gaze dropped to her belly, and for the first time, a flicker of something annoyance perhaps crossed his face. "The baby changes the equation," he said. "Serafina's family values a clean slate. A child from a previous marriage, especially one born so close to our union, would be seen as an untidy affair, a loose end from a past life." "A loose end?" she shrieked, the sound raw and wounded, a mother animal's cry of disbelief. "He is your son. He is a part of you, M. And because he is a part of me, I want this handled cleanly and efficiently," Julian said, his voice dropping to a low, conspiratorial tone, as if sharing a business secret. He took a step closer. "I have a proposal. The settlement is contingent upon one non-negotiable term. You terminate the pregnancy." The air left her lungs in a single, ragged gasp. The world tilted violently. He wasn't just abandoning their child, he was ordering his execution. He was asking her to erase the last living piece of the love she thought they'd shared, to scrub clean the evidence of their history, all for the sake of his glorious future. "Get out," she whispered, the words trembling with a rage so profound, so absolute, it felt like it could shatter her bones. "Alara, be reasonable," he said, a hint of impatience in his voice. He genuinely didn't understand her reaction. In his mind, he was offering a practical solution. "This is a clean break for both of us. It frees you from the past." "Get out!" she screamed, her hand closing around a heavy porcelain lamp. With a guttural cry born of unimaginable pain, she hurled it at him. It smashed against the wall just past his head, the explosion of ceramic, a visceral echo of her heart shattering into a million pieces. He didn't even flinch. He simply smoothed the lapels of his suit, his expression hardening into one of cold contempt. Her emotional outburst, her grief, was, to him, merely confirmation that she was not fit for his new world. "I see you're going to be difficult," he said. "I had hoped we could handle this with dignity." "Dignity?" she sobbed, her body racked with a storm of grief and fury. "You come into our baby's nursery and you ask me to murder him for your career, and you talk about dignity?" "Fine," he said, his voice like ice. "Have it your way. But the prenup your father insisted upon is ironclad. You will leave this marriage with the sterling name and nothing else. The penthouse, the cars, the accounts, they are all assets of the Croft Empire, an empire I built." He was cutting her off completely, stranding her, using the very legal document her father had designed to protect her as a weapon against her. "My father, he trusted you," she choked out. Julian looked at her one last time, his eyes devoid of any warmth or memory of the love they had shared. "Your father was a good man, Alara, but he was sentimental," he said with chilling finality. "He made a bad investment. Now, I'm correcting it." He turned and walked out of the nursery, leaving her to sink to the floor amidst the wreckage of their future. The sound of his footsteps faded, leaving only the sound of her own broken sobs. Outside, the storm finally broke, the rain lashing against the windows of the gilded cage that had, in an instant, become her tomb. The days that followed were not merely cruel. They were a masterclass in systematic erasure. Julian Croft, the architect of her perfect life, now applied his formidable skills to its demolition. He moved with the swift, impersonal efficiency of a corporate raider dismantling a company for its assets. There was no passion in his actions, no lingering anger, only the cold, clean logic of a problem being solved. Alara Sterling and the child she carried were the problem. The first blow came not as a shout, but as a quiet, polite email from the building's management. It informed her, in sterile corporate language, that the corporate lease on penthouse 88 Amperes was being terminated. She had 30 days to vacate the premises. The words floated on the screen, detached and surreal. 30 days to pack up a life, a dream, a future that no longer existed. Then came the financial strangulation. The joint bank accounts, which had once seemed as boundless as the ocean, were frozen, then drained to zero. The credit cards, symbols of a life without limits, were declined one by one. The Blacktown car and its kind-faced driver, who had known her since her wedding day, simply disappeared. Her world, once a sprawling map of privilege, shrank with breathtaking speed to the size of a few cardboard boxes and the dwindling balance of a small, personal account she'd kept from before her marriage. The social exile was perhaps the most insidious torture. The society friends who had toasted her at her baby shower just weeks before now looked through her at the few places she still frequented. Their whispers followed her like a chill wind, a chorus of judgment and pity. She was no longer Elara Sterling Croft, the elegant wife of a titan. She was a scandal, a cautionary tale whispered over cocktails and canapes. A woman scorned was a tragedy, but a woman rendered poor, in their world, that was the only unforgivable sin. Poverty was a contagion, and no one wanted to stand too close. She packed the nursery herself, a task that felt like packing away parts of her own heart. Each tiny, folded outfit, each soft blanket, was a fresh stab of pain. She was a ghost, haunting the shell of her own life, surrounded by beautiful objects that no longer belonged to her. The city she had once considered her kingdom now felt alien and hostile. Every gleaming skyscraper seemed to mock her, a monument to the power and wealth that had been so easily stolen from her. With the last of her savings, she rented a small, one-bedroom apartment in a dreary part of Brooklyn, a place so far removed from the gleaming spires of Manhattan it felt like a different country. The air was thick with the smell of exhaust, fumes, and street food. The constant wail of sirens at night replaced the gentle, climate-controlled hum of the penthouse. It was a humbling, terrifying free fall from the heavens, and she was discovering there was no safety net. Piece by piece, she sold off the remnants of her former life. The diamond earrings Julian had given her for their first anniversary, to match the sparkle in your eyes, he had said, paid for 3 months' rent in the cramped, walk-up apartment. Her grandmother's pearl necklace, a family heirloom, covered the initial doctor's visits for the baby, ensuring at least that the life inside her was still cared for. Each transaction felt like a betrayal, as if she was selling off memories, trading pieces of her past for a few more days of survival in a bleak present. The absolute nadir arrived on a grey, drizzly afternoon. Heavily pregnant, her ankles swollen and her body aching with a weariness that was more than physical, she stood in a crowded grocery store. Her few items were on the conveyor belt: a carton of milk, a loaf of bread, some eggs, and the prenatal vitamins that were her one non-negotiable expense. The total came to $27.42. A fortune. She swiped her debit card. The machine beeped aggressively, declined. A hot, suffocating flush of shame crept up her neck. Her hands began to tremble. "Just a moment," she murmured to the cashier, whose face was a mask of bored impatience. She tried again, praying it was a mistake. Declined. The account was empty. She had miscalculated, overdrawn by a few miserable dollars. "Ma'am?" the cashier asked, her voice edged with annoyance now. The people in the line behind her began to shift and murmur, their impatience a palpable force. Ilara's eyes filled with hot, humiliating tears. She fumbled in her purse, her shaking hands searching for a few stray dollar bills she knew weren't there. The simple act of buying food had become an insurmountable obstacle. Defeated, she was forced to leave the groceries on the counter, murmuring a choked apology as she fled the store. She didn't look back, but she could feel the stares, a mixture of pity and judgment, burning into her back. She walked for blocks in the rain, not caring that she was soaked to the bone. The physical discomfort was nothing compared to the cold, hard knot of humiliation in her stomach. It wasn't just about the money, it was about the utter and complete loss of dignity, of agency. She was going to bring a child into this world, a world where she couldn't even afford to buy a carton of milk. That night, she sat in the dark, in her small, unfamiliar apartment, the sounds of the city, an oppressive roar outside her window. The final eviction notice for the penthouse had arrived that morning, a cold, official document marking the final burial of her old life. She was utterly alone, stripped of her identity, her security, and her hope. The fall was complete. Despair A cold and heavy beast threatened to swallow her whole. She wrapped her arms around her belly and felt a gentle kick, a tiny flutter of life, a stubborn reminder of the one thing Julian could not take from her. He was all she had left. He was everything. As the city raged outside, she made a silent promise to the son she had not yet met, a vow whispered into the darkness of her desolate room. I will not let him break us. I will not let this be your story. I will find a way. But as she stared out at the rain-streaked window, at a world that had become hostile and foreign, for the first time in her life, she had no idea how. 3 weeks before her due date, the final notice arrived. It wasn't delivered in a crisp envelope, but was a stark, red-lettered warning taped crudely to her apartment door, a public declaration of her failure for all the neighbors in the dingy hallway to see. Final notice of eviction. The words seemed to scream at her. Panic, cold and sharp as a shard of ice, seized her. She had nowhere to go. Her remaining funds were nearly depleted, and the prospect of finding a new apartment in her condition with no income and no references was an impossibility. She spent the morning on the phone, her voice thick with a shame that felt like swallowing dust, calling homeless shelters. The voices on the other end were kind but firm. We're full. There's a waiting list. Have you tried the city assistance program? Each call was another door slammed shut in her face. As she sat on her worn sofa, the terrifying, visceral reality of giving birth on the streets closing in on her, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on the door. Her heart leaped into her throat, a frantic, trapped bird. It was the landlord, she thought, or worse, a city marshal, come to physically remove her from the premises. She froze, hoping that if she remained silent, they would go away. The knock came again, louder this time, more insistent. It wasn't the impatient rap of a landlord, this was something else. With a heavy sigh, her body a cumbersome weight, she heaved herself to her feet and shuffled to the door. She peered through the peephole, her eye clouded by years of grime. A man in a dark, impeccably tailored suit stood in the dim, flickering light of the hallway. For a moment, she didn't recognize him. A figure so out of place in this world of decay, he seemed like an apparition. Then, as his face came into focus, her blood ran cold. It was Silas Thorne. Her mind raced, a whirlwind of fear and confusion. What was he doing here? How had he found her? Was this some new, cruel game of Julian's, sending his arch-rival to gloat at her ruin, to witness the final, pathetic chapter of her downfall? A fierce, protective instinct, primal and powerful, flared within her. It was the she-bear defending her den. She undid the flimsy latch, opening the door only a few inches, creating a barrier with her own body. "What do you want?" she demanded, her voice stronger and colder than she felt. Silas Thorne's eyes, the same intense, analytical eyes she remembered from the gala, took in her appearance in a single, sweeping glance. He saw the worn-out maternity dress, the fear etched onto her face, the shabby, desperate apartment, visible in the sliver of space behind her. He didn't mock her, he didn't smile. His face was a stoic, unreadable mask. "Mrs. Croft," he said, his voice a low, calm baritone that seemed to absorb the frantic energy in the air. "It's Sterling," she corrected him sharply, clinging to the one thing that was still truly hers, her father's name. "And I have nothing to say to you. I have no business with any friend of my husband's." "Your ex-husband," he clarified, the distinction subtle but significant. "And Julian Croft and I are not, nor have we ever been, friends. Quite the opposite." He paused, his gaze unwavering. "I'm here because of your father, Arthur Sterling." The mention of her father, dead for 3 years now, was a shock that momentarily disarmed her. It was a name from a different world, a different life. "My father? He was my mentor," Silas said simply, with no embellishment. When I was 19 years old, with nothing but a half-baked business plan for a software company scribbled on a napkin, he saw something in me. Everyone else saw a kid with no connections and no credentials. Your father saw potential. He gave me a small seed investment, not from his company, but from his own pocket. He made me promise to never mention it, to build my own name. That investment, that act of faith, was the foundation of everything I have today. I owe him a debt I can never truly repay. Ilara stared at him, speechless. Her father had a knack for finding and nurturing young talent, but he had never mentioned a Silas Thorne. This man, this corporate titan, this figure feared by all on Wall Street, was a product of her father's quiet, unheralded generosity. I've been following what Julian has done to you, Silas continued, his voice hardening slightly. What he is doing is not just immoral, it's a desecration of your father's legacy. Arthur Sterling built his company on integrity and honor. Julian is destroying it with greed, and he is trying to destroy his own son, your father's grandson. Why are you here, Mr. Thorne? She asked again, her voice softer this time, the sharp edges of her fear beginning to dull. I'm here to offer you a proposition, he said, getting straight to the point. I want to help you. Not out of pity, he added, as if reading her mind, but out of a sense of honor to the man who helped me. I know you're facing eviction. I know your funds are gone. I know Julian plans to sue you for custody the moment the child is born, claiming you are unstable and financially incapable. Ilara leaned against the door frame, the weight of her pregnancy suddenly immense, the truth of his words a crushing blow. What kind of proposition? I own a secluded estate in upstate New York. It is fully staffed and completely secure. You can live there for as long as you need. You will have the best medical care, financial stability, everything you and your child require. You will want for nothing. The offer was so astounding, so far beyond the realm of possibility, it sounded like a trap, a devil's bargain. And what do you want in return? She asked, her suspicion, her shield against the world, returning. No one does something like this for nothing. Silas's expression remained unreadable, but his eyes held a flicker of something that looked like respect for her question. Julian's greatest weakness has always been his pride. He sees his child not as a human being, but as an asset, a continuation of his dynasty. He abandoned his son for a business deal, but the moment that child is born, his ego will demand he possess him. He will try to take him from you. He took a step closer, his presence seeming to fill the cramped, dingy hallway. My proposal is this, he said, his voice low and firm. I will give you all the resources you need to protect your child. I will give you a fortress. In return, you allow me to help you raise him. Let me provide him with the security and the future his father has stolen from him. Let me stand as a bulwark between your family and Julian Croft. You want to raise my son? She stammered, the idea both horrifying and strangely compelling. I want to protect him, Silas corrected gently. And in doing so, I want to ensure that Julian Croft can never lay claim to the legacy of the man he betrayed. Arthur Sterling's grandson will not be raised by a man like that. I will not allow it. It was a strange, almost feudal pact, a deal born of honor, revenge, and the ghost of a man they had both admired. Ilara looked at this powerful, enigmatic man, and for the first time, she saw not a threat, but a potential lifeline, a dangerous, unorthodox, and desperate lifeline. He was offering her and her unborn child a sanctuary. The alternative was the street. She thought of the cold humiliation of the grocery store, the damning red letters of the eviction notice, and Julian's chilling words in the nursery. She had promised her son she would find a way. Perhaps this was it. There will have to be conditions, she said, her mind, dulled by despair, slowly beginning to work again, to strategize, to survive. My son will have my name, Sterling, and I will be his mother, his only parent. You are a guardian, a benefactor, nothing more. Silas nodded once, a sharp, decisive gesture of acceptance. Of course, he is your son. I am simply offering my protection. Elara took a deep, shaky, shuddering intake of air. She was making a deal with her husband's greatest enemy, entrusting her future and her child's future to a man she barely knew. It was a leap of faith into a dark abyss, but it was better than the certain ruin that awaited her. "All right, Mr. Thorne," she said, meeting his intense gaze with a flicker of her own renewed strength. "You have a deal." The estate, known simply as Thorne Manor, was less a house and more a kingdom, carved out of the lush, rolling hills of upstate New York. The journey there felt like a passage into another world. They left the city's oppressive grayness behind, and the landscape slowly softened into a tapestry of deep greens and rich, dark earth. A long, winding driveway, flanked by ancient oak trees that formed a cathedral-like canopy, led to a stately grey stone mansion. It didn't loom. It commanded, its architecture, a blend of old-world strength and clean, modern lines, overlooking a private lake that shimmered like a sheet of dark steel in the late afternoon Sunday. It was a fortress, not of intimidation, but of profound tranquility and immense wealth. Silas, true to his word, was a discreet and respectful presence. He was the architect of her rescue, but he was not her warden. He installed her in a beautiful suite of rooms in the East Wing, overlooking formal gardens that faded into wilder woods. The rooms were filled with light, furnished with a quiet, understated elegance that was the antithesis of Julian's cold, ostentatious style. He had arranged for a team of the best prenatal doctors to make house calls, and he had ensured she had everything she could possibly need, from a library of books to a kitchen stocked with any food she craved. His staff were professional and kind, led by a warm but no-nonsense housekeeper named Mrs. Gable, a woman with compassionate eyes who seemed to understand Elara's situation without a single word being exchanged. For the first time in months, Elara felt her shoulders, which had been permanently hunched in a posture of defense, begin to relax. She could breathe. She was safe. Silas worked mostly from a large, book-lined office on the ground floor, a command center from which he ran his global empire. Their interactions were initially formal, almost stilted. They would occasionally share a quiet dinner in the grand dining room, the long table, a vast, polished expanse between them. During these meals, he would tell her stories about her father, tales she had never heard. He spoke of Arthur Sterling, not as the titan of industry she knew, but as the mentor who saw potential where others saw none. He recounted tales of her father's shrewd business acumen, his surprising, dry humor, and his unwavering belief in people. "He told me once," Silas said one evening, swirling the wine in his glass, "that a man's true wealth isn't in his portfolio, but in his word." Julian never understood that. Through Silas, Elara felt a connection to the father she missed so dearly, and she began to see the man behind the ruthless corporate reputation. She saw a man of profound, almost archaic loyalty, driven by a strict personal code of honor. He wasn't just fulfilling a debt, he was upholding a principle. As her due date approached, a strange, quiet companionship grew between them. It was a bond forged in the shared space of unspoken things, their mutual respect for her father and their mutual contempt for Julian. He would find her in the library, struggling to reach a book, and would retrieve it for her without a word, leaving it on the table beside her. She, in turn, would leave the business section of the newspaper on his desk, open to an article she thought he'd find interesting. They rarely spoke of Julian, but his presence lingered like a poison in the air, the unspoken reason for their bizarre, symbiotic alliance. The night she went into labor, a fierce thunderstorm was raging outside, the sky ripped open by jagged slashes of lightning, mirroring the beautiful chaos of birth. It was Silas who found her in the hallway, leaning against the wall, breathing through a contraction, her face pale but determined. His composure was absolute. All the cold calculation of the businessman vanished, replaced by a focused, protective calm. He helped her to the car he had waiting, already running, and spoke to her in a calm, steady voice during the drive to the private hospital wing he had reserved. He didn't offer platitudes or false reassurances. He simply gave her facts: how long the drive would be, that the medical team was ready, that she was safe. His steadiness was an anchor in her sea of pain. He never left the waiting room. Leo Sterling was born just as the sun began to rise, the storm having passed, leaving the world washed clean and new. He was small and perfect, with a tuft of dark hair and his mother's deep blue eyes. When the nurse placed him in Alara's arms, her heart expanded with a love so fierce, so all-encompassing, it eclipsed all the pain and betrayal of the past year. This tiny, helpless being was the reason for everything. He was the promise she had kept. He was hers. Later that day, after she had rested, she allowed Silas to see him. He stood in the doorway of her hospital room, and for the first time since she'd met him, he looked hesitant, almost out of place. The titan of industry, a man who could command boardrooms and bend markets to his will, seemed humbled by the sight of a tiny, sleeping infant. "Come in, Silas," she said softly. He approached the bassinet slowly, his movements careful, his gaze fixed on the baby. He looked down at Leo, his usually stern features softening into an expression of profound wonder and something else, something akin to reverence. "He looks like you," Silas said, his voice quiet, almost a whisper. "He has my eyes," Alara agreed, a tired but happy smile on her face. "But that frown is all his own." Silas reached out a single, long finger and gently stroked the baby's cheek. The baby stirred, a tiny furrow in his brow, but didn't wake. In that small, silent gesture, Alara saw the truth of his promise. This wasn't just about revenge against Julian or a debt to her father anymore. This powerful, solitary man was captivated. He was not just a guardian, he was already a protector. Meanwhile, hundreds of miles away in Manhattan, the wedding of Julian Croft and Serafina Beaumont was splashed across the cover of Vogue. The photos showed them in their sterile, art-filled apartment, smiling for the cameras, the perfect power couple. The article spoke of their plans for the future, for the Croft-Beaumont dynasty. There was no mention of a child. Julian heard about the birth through a discreet report from a private investigator he had hired to track Alara. The news landed with a dull, unexpected thud in his chest. A son. He had a son. He looked at the long-lens pictures the PI had taken. Alara leaving the hospital, looking tired but radiant, and beside her, carrying the baby's car seat with a proprietary, protective air, was Silas Thorne, his sworn enemy. A black, possessive rage, cold and sharp, filled him. Thorne was meddling in his affairs, touching what was his. This child, this loose end he had ordered to be erased, was now alive, well, and under the protection of his greatest rival. The existence of Leo Sterling was an untidy variable in his perfect equation, a loose thread in the flawless tapestry of his new life. And Julian Croft did not tolerate loose threads. For now, he would ignore it. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that one day he would come to collect his asset. The next 6 years passed in an idyllic quietude, that felt both precious and precarious, like a secret garden cultivated in the shadow of a volcano. Thorn Manor ceased to be a refuge and became a home, a world unto itself, where Leo Sterling could grow shielded from the corrosive identity of his biological father. To Leo, the world was not a concrete jungle of ambition and betrayal. It was the sprawling estate, with its whispering woods, its secret gardens, and its shimmering, mysterious lake. And family was not a matter of bloodlines and dynasties. It was the unwavering presence of his mother, Ilara, and the tall, quiet man he came to call, simply and naturally, Dad. Silas's transformation from benefactor to father was a gradual and profound alchemy. The cold, calculating businessman who ran a global empire with ruthless efficiency still existed, locked away in the grand, book-lined office on the ground floor. But the moment Silas stepped out of that room, he belonged to Leo. The titan of industry learned to kneel, his expensive trousers dusting the grass as he patiently taught a small boy how to skip stones across the lake, their shared laughter echoing in the crisp autumn air. He sat on a tiny, brightly colored chair at a tiny table for imaginary tea parties, his large frame comically out of place, a serious expression on his face as he inquired about the health of Leo's worn stuffed bear, Sir Reginald. He became the keeper of rituals. He was the one who read bedtime stories, his deep, calm baritone giving voice to dragons and knights, his long finger tracing the words for the small boy nestled beside him. He was the one who was there for every milestone and every mishap. The first tentative steps, the first triumphant bike ride without training wheels, every scraped knee that needed a bandage, every feverish night that required a cool hand on a warm forehead, and every triumphant, crayon-scrolled picture that was presented to him as a masterpiece and treated as such. He never overstepped. He always deferred to Ilara on major parenting decisions. His respect for her role as Leo's mother, absolute, but his devotion was a quiet, constant, unwavering force. He was the steady, granite rock against which their small, unconventional family was built. He was not replacing a father, he was simply being one. Ilara, too, flourished in this sanctuary. With Silas's quiet encouragement and financial backing, she went back to her first love, landscape architecture. What had once been a mere hobby blossomed into a true vocation. Silas had one of the manor's old carriage houses converted into a magnificent design studio for her, with skylights and vast drafting tables. She started a small boutique firm, taking on select clients who valued her unique vision of creating harmony between structure and nature. She worked not out of necessity, but out of a reclaimed passion, slowly rebuilding her identity, not as Julian Croft's discarded wife, but as Ilara Sterling, a respected designer and a loving, present mother. The quiet, respectful bond between her and Silas deepened into a profound, trusting friendship. It was a partnership in the truest sense of the word, built on a foundation of shared purpose and mutual respect. The question of romance never arose, not even as a whisper in the quiet evenings they sometimes spent together in the library after Leo was asleep. Their shared purpose Leo was too sacred to complicate with the fragile, messy business of their own hearts. Their love was not for each other, but it flowed in the same direction, a powerful confluence of devotion centered on the boy who was the sun in their shared universe. Meanwhile, in New York City, Julian Croft's life was a perfect, cold, and hollow mirror image of theirs. The merger with Beaumont Telecom had made him spectacularly wealthy and unimaginably powerful. He was a king in the concrete jungle, his name spoken with a mixture of fear and awe. He and Serafina were fixtures on the social scene, their lives a glossy, endless performance of marital bliss and corporate synergy dutifully chronicled in the society pages. But behind the closed doors of their minimalist penthouse, a space that felt more like a modern art museum than a home, the silence was deafening. Their marriage, a contract from the start, had one glaring, unfulfilled clause: an heir. After years of trying, of cold, clinical treatments, and quiet, bitter disappointments, their team of expensive doctors delivered the final, sterile verdict. Serafina was unable to conceive. The news shattered the fragile truce of their relationship, exposing its transactional core for what it was. There would be no Croft-Beaumont dynasty. Conrad Beaumont, his father-in-law, began to look at Julian with unconcealed disappointment. A king without an heir is not a king. He is merely a placeholder. It was then that Julian's thoughts, which had occasionally strayed to the son he had abandoned, began to fixate. The loose end, the complication, the untidy affair, was now a 6-year-old boy. His obsession started small, a dark seed planted in the barren ground of his unfulfilled ambition. He reactivated the private investigator, paying an exorbitant amount of money for regular updates. First came written reports, then photographs delivered to a secure, encrypted server. He would stare at them for hours in the dead of night, a glass of expensive scotch in his hand, the city lights glittering meaninglessly outside his window. There was Leo on a small pony, his face alight with pure joy, while Silas Thorne led him, a rare, genuine smile on the man's face. There was Leo on a swing, soaring towards the sky, being pushed by his mother, her face a portrait of maternal love. There was Leo at a school play, dressed ridiculously as a tree, with Silas and Ilara sitting in the front row, looking for all the world like a proud, normal family. And in every photo, in the sharp, determined line of the boy's jaw, in the way his dark hair fell across his forehead, Julian saw a ghost of himself. This was his son, his blood, his legacy, waiting in the wilderness. And Silas Thorne, the man he despised more than any other, was raising him. The thought was a vile poison, twisting his pride into a knot of jealous, possessive fury. Thorne hadn't just beaten him in business, he had stolen his son, his very immortality. The breaking point arrived with quiet, devastating force on his 42nd birthday. Serafina threw him a lavish party, filling their penthouse with 100 people who admired his wealth but knew nothing of the man. As they raised their glasses to toast his success, a notification pinged on his secure phone. It was a new photo from the PI. It was of Leo, a gap-toothed grin on his face, proudly holding up a crooked, homemade birthday card decorated with glitter and macaroni. The caption read, "Subject celebrating Silas Thorne's 45th birthday today." They were celebrating his enemy. His son, his blood, was calling his enemy Dad. The crystal glass in Julian's hand felt suddenly fragile. The illusion of his perfect life, the kingdom he had sacrificed everything to build, crumbled into dust. The wealth, the power, the beautiful wife, it was all meaningless. He didn't want a dynasty anymore. He wanted his son. The boy was no longer a complication to be erased or an asset to be possessed. In Julian's warped, obsessive mind, Leo had become the prize, the final, ultimate victory in his long war against Silas Thorne. And Julian Croft never, ever lost. He excused himself from his own party, walked into his silent, stark office, and picked up the phone. He dialed the number for the most ruthless, feared family law attorney in the state. "My name is Nathaniel Vance," he said, his voice cold and clear as ice. "I want to get custody of my son." The declaration of war did not arrive with the roar of a cannon, but with the quiet hum of a courier's van winding its way up the long, tree-lined driveway of Thorne Manor. It was a crisp October morning, The autumn leaves were a riot of gold and crimson, and the air was clean and sharp. Alara was in her studio, sketching a design for a public garden, while Leo was at school. The piece was so profound, so deeply rooted after 6 years, that she had allowed herself to believe it was permanent. The documents were delivered by a stone-faced man in a nondescript uniform. He simply asked her to sign for the package, his eyes revealing nothing. The sheer thickness of the binder was the first act of intimidation. It was heavy in her hands, a dense, menacing weight. She carried it into the manor's library, the room where she had spent so many peaceful evenings, and sat down at the large mahogany table, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drum beat against her ribs. Her hands trembled as she opened the cover and read the first page. The legal jargon was dense, but the title was starkly, brutally clear. In the matter of the custody of Leo Sterling. Petitioner, Julian Croft. Respondent, Alara Sterling. It was a work of fiction, a masterpiece of character assassination, so twisted and cunning, it stole her breath. Page after page, Julian's lawyers had woven a narrative that painted her as an unstable, gold-digging opportunist who, after being left for her own emotional volatility, had fallen into the clutches of a reclusive and dangerous billionaire. It alleged that Silas Thorne, a man of questionable character with a mysterious past, had insidiously alienated the child from his natural, loving father. It portrayed Julian as the grieving patriarch, a man who, after a period of profound emotional turmoil following their acrimonious divorce, was now financially and emotionally prepared to provide his son with the stable, loving, two-parent home he deserved. It spoke of his deep yearning to connect with his only child, a right that had been, it claimed, maliciously denied to him. It was a tapestry woven from lies, half-truths, and the cruel, deliberate inversion of reality. It took the truth of her suffering and reframed it as her crime. She was still staring at a particularly venomous paragraph, describing her as financially dependent and emotionally compromised when Silas walked in. He had been out for a ride on one of the estate's trails, and he still wore his riding boots. He stopped dead when he saw the binder on the table and the look on her face. He didn't need to ask what it was. He came and stood behind her, reading over her shoulder. His presence was a solid, reassuring weight. As his eyes scanned the pages, she felt the muscles in his back tense, his entire posture hardening into something resembling granite. "He's not just coming for Leo," he said, his voice a low, dangerous growl she had never heard before. It was the voice of the ruthless competitor, the corporate raider, now awakened in defense of his home. "He's coming for everything. He wants to burn this place to the ground, with all of us in it." The battle that followed was as brutal and public as Julian could make it. He understood that the court of public opinion was as important as any judge's chamber. He used the media as his personal weapon, strategically leaking sanitized, heart-wrenching versions of his court filings to gossip columnists and sympathetic journalists. The headlines screamed across the tabloids and online news sites: "Billionaire tycoon fights to reclaim son from reclusive rival. A father's heartbreak. Julian Croft's secret custody battle." In the carefully crafted narrative Julian was selling to the world, they were the villains. Alara was the bitter ex-wife, and Silas was the shadowy interloper who had stolen another man's child. Anonymous sources close to the family were quoted expressing their concern for the boy, raised in such an isolated and unnatural environment. Julian's lawyers were relentless. They descended like a pack of wolves, their goal not just to win, but to wound, to demoralize, to destroy. They subpoenaed Alara's financial records from the past 6 years, seeking to prove she was nothing more than a kept woman. They subpoenaed her therapy notes from the dark days after the divorce, twisting her grief and trauma into evidence of her supposed instability. They filed motions to depose Mrs. Gable and other members of the staff, hoping to twist their loyalty into evidence of a conspiracy to paint Silas as a controlling puppet master. They argued in preliminary motions that Thorn Manor was not a home but a gilded prison, a place that stunted a child's social development. They argued that Silas Thorne's very presence as a man with no biological claim was detrimental to the child's psychological well-being and sense of identity. The day Alara had to sit for her deposition was one of the worst of her life. For 6 grueling hours in a sterile, windowless conference room, Julian's lead attorney, a famously brutal litigator named Beatrice Shaw, picked apart her life, her choices, her very worth as a mother. "Miss Sterling," Shaw began, her voice dripping with a condescending sweetness that was more insulting than any shout, "isn't it true that at the time you accepted Mr. Thorne's generous offer, you were penniless and facing eviction from a low-income apartment in Brooklyn?" "I was in a difficult financial situation," Alara countered, her voice steady despite the furious pounding of her heart. "Because my ex-husband, your client, illegally and unilaterally cut me off from all marital assets in violation of our prenuptial agreement." Shaw waved a dismissive hand. "So, facing life on the streets, you entered into a financial arrangement with your ex-husband's most famous business enemy, an arrangement that has provided you with a life of unimaginable luxury for the past 6 years. In exchange for, what exactly, Miss Sterling? Your son's affection?" "I made an alliance to protect my child from a man who wanted him erased," Alara said, her voice clear and cold. "Or did you sell him?" Shaw hissed, the question landing with the force of a physical blow. Alara met the lawyer's cold, reptilian gaze and did not flinch. "My son is not a commodity," she said, her voice low and firm. "That is a concept you should perhaps discuss with your client." Through it all, they protected Leo. He knew only that there was a disagreement involving his birth father, a man he had never met and had no memory of. But even with their protection, the tendrils of the conflict began to seep into his world. He would come home from school and find his mother and Silas in quiet, tense conversations that would stop the moment he entered the room. He could feel the atmosphere in the manor shift from one of peaceful sanctuary to one of a fortress under siege. The long war had begun, and Alara knew, with a mother's terrifying certainty, that only one side could be left standing at the end of it. While Julian Croft waged his war in the public arena of headlines and soundbites, Silas Thorne prepared for battle in the shadows. He understood Julian's strategy perfectly. It was a war of attrition, designed to exhaust, humiliate, and bankrupt Alara, emotionally and spiritually, long before they ever stepped foot in a courtroom. Julian wasn't just filing a lawsuit, he was orchestrating a siege. But Julian had made a critical miscalculation. He had forgotten that Silas Thorne did not build empires on charm. He built them on data, strategy, and the relentless application of overwhelming force. He was a man who saw the world as a complex chessboard, and he had been anticipating this move for 6 years. Silas did not engage in the public mudslinging. To do so would be to play Julian's game. Instead, he mobilized his own formidable resources, not to attack, but to defend. He assembled a legal team that was the antithesis of Julian's pack of media-savvy sharks. They were a quiet, methodical army of the best legal minds in the country, specialists in family law, forensic accounting, and character defense. Their headquarters became a suite of rooms in the west wing of the manor, a silent, efficient command center that hummed with quiet intensity 24 hours a day. Their strategy was simple and powerful. They would build a fortress of evidence. While Julian's team was busy trying to twist the past, Silas's team meticulously and irrefutably documented the present. They were not building a narrative, they were building a factual record of a life. For 6 years, Ilara had kept detailed journals. For 6 years, Silas had, with quiet foresight, ensured that Leo's life was chronicled. There were albums filled with photographs. Leo taking his first steps on the great lawn, his small hand gripping Silas's finger, Leo laughing as he baked cookies with his mother in the manor's warm, sunlit kitchen, flour dusting his nose, Leo asleep on Silas's chest in front of the library fire. There were hours of video footage from birthdays, school plays, and lazy summer afternoons by the lake. They gathered school reports, which detailed a bright, well-adjusted, and popular little boy. They collected testimony from his teachers, his pediatrician, the parents of his friends, all of whom painted a consistent and vivid picture of a cherished, thriving child who was deeply bonded to both his mother and to Silas, the man he knew as his father. Every crayon drawing, every school project, every doctor's checkup became a brick in their fortress. While Ilara found the process of dredging up the past for her depositions agonizing, she found a different kind of strength in compiling this history of Leo's present. It was a tangible reminder of what she was fighting for. Each photo, each report card, was a testament to the happy, stable, and richly fulfilling life they had built from the ashes of Julian's betrayal. This was not a gilded prison, it was a vibrant, loving home. One evening, after a particularly grueling day of meetings with the lawyers, Ilara found Silas in the library, staring out at the darkening landscape. He looked weary, the immense pressure of the battle showing in the tense set of his shoulders. "He won't win, will he?" she asked, her voice quiet. Silas turned from the window. In the dim light, the hard lines of his face seemed softer. "Julian's entire case is built on a lie," he said. "He is pretending to be a man. He is not a remorseful father. Lies are brittle, Ilara. Our job is to apply the right amount of pressure in the right place, and they will shatter." "And if they don't?" she whispered, the fear a constant, cold companion. He walked over to her, his presence solid and comforting in the quiet room. "Then we will still be here," he said, his gaze meeting hers. It was not a promise of victory, but something more profound. A promise of endurance. "We will not break." The emotional toll was immense. Ilara found it difficult to sleep, her nights filled with anxious dreams. She had to force herself to maintain a facade of normalcy for Leo, to greet him with a bright smile when he came home from school, to listen to his stories about his day while her mind was churning with legal strategies and worst-case scenarios. The most difficult part was the insidious way Julian's narrative began to seep into her own self-doubt. In the darkest hours of the night, she would find herself questioning her choices. Had she been a fool to trust Silas? Had she inadvertently trapped her son in the middle of a war between two powerful men? Was she, as Julian's lawyers claimed, nothing more than a dependent? It was Silas who, without knowing the depths of her fears, consistently pulled her back from the brink. He did not offer easy reassurances. Instead, he would simply bring her a cup of tea in her studio when he saw her working too late, or suggest a walk by the lake to clear their heads. He would talk to her about Leo, about a funny thing the boy had said, or a new milestone he had reached, subtly reminding her of their shared purpose, of the truth that anchored them. One afternoon, as the hearing date loomed closer, Ilara found a small, framed photograph on her bedside table. It was a picture she hadn't seen in years. It had been taken on Leo's 3rd birthday. In it, Leo was sitting on Silas's shoulders, his small hands tangled in Silas's dark hair, a wide, joyful grin on his face. Silas was looking up at him, and his expression was one of pure, unguarded adoration. She knew, without asking, that Silas had put it there. It was not a strategic move, it was a quiet message, a piece of irrefutable evidence for her alone. It was the truth, and in a war built on lies, the truth was their most powerful weapon. She picked up the frame, her fingers tracing the image of the man who had become a father and the boy who was her world, and she felt her resolve harden into steel. Julian could wage his war with lies and shadows, but they would fight him with the undeniable light of their reality. The climax of their war did not unfold in a grand public coliseum, but in the sterile, wood-paneled quiet of a closed-door custody hearing. The room was deliberately intimate, designed to focus on the best interests of the child, a phrase that echoed with bitter irony in the charged air. There was no jury, only a stern-faced, experienced judge, a woman named Judge Adrian Salgado, whose expression revealed nothing. Julian was there, looking powerful and confident in a dark, impeccably tailored suit. He sat at the petitioner's table, the very picture of concerned fatherhood, with Serafina, a silent, anxious statue beside him, her face pale and her hands clenched in her lap. He had spent weeks being coached, and when he took the stand, his performance was flawless. He spoke with a carefully modulated tone of profound regret, his gaze fixed earnestly on the judge. He spoke of his immaturity and the immense pressures of his career that had led him to make the greatest mistake of his life. He painted a picture of a man who had spent 6 years haunted by the absence of his son, a man who had finally found the stability and emotional maturity to be the father he was always meant to be. He never mentioned his demand that Alara terminate the pregnancy. In his telling, their separation was a tragic, mutual drifting apart. It was a masterful, compelling fiction. Then, it was Silas's turn to be cross-examined by Julian's lead attorney, Beatrice Shaw. She circled him like a predator, her questions dripping with insinuation and contempt. "Mr. Thorne," she began, her voice sharp, "you are not this child's father. You have no biological claim. You have no legal right. You are, in legal terms, a third party. So I ask you, what are you, exactly, to Leo Sterling?" She posed the question as if the answer was self-evident. He was nothing. Silas did not look at the lawyer. He looked directly at Judge Salgado, his expression calm, his voice clear and devoid of the anger they were trying to provoke. "You are correct," he began, his candor surprising the room. "I have no biological claim. My name is not on his birth certificate. By those metrics, I am a third party." He paused, letting the admissions settle in the quiet room. "But I am the man who holds his hand when he's scared of the dark after a nightmare. I am the one who cheers the loudest at his soccer games, even when his team is losing terribly. I am the one who tries to explain why the sky is blue and who listens to his endless knock-knock jokes, even when I already know the punchline. I am the one who taught him how to ride a bike and held him when he fell. And I am the one who will be there to help him with his homework tonight when we get home." He finally turned his gaze from the judge to Beatrice Shaw, his eyes like polished steel. "My claim isn't written on a legal document. My claim is written in the 6 years of bedtime stories, bandaged knees, and unconditional love. So to answer your question, Miss Shaw, I am his father in every way that counts. I am his dad." A profound silence filled the room. Judge Salgado's impassive mask flickered for just a moment. But the final, devastating blow came from a source no one, least of all Julian, had anticipated. Silas's lead lawyer, a calm, methodical man named Mr. Davies, called his final witness, We call Serafina Beaumont Croft to the stand. Julian's team objected furiously, arguing spousal privilege, relevance, and a dozen other legal points. But Mr. Davies calmly countered that Serafina's testimony was directly relevant to Julian's claim of providing a stable, two-parent home. The judge, her curiosity clearly piqued, allowed it. Serafina walked to the stand, her movements stiff, her composure as fragile as spun glass. She avoided looking at her husband, whose face had become a thunderous mask of rage. Mr. Davies approached her gently. "Mrs. Croft," he began, his tone kind, "in his petition, your husband states his profound desire to provide a stable, two-parent home for his son, Leo. Do you share this desire?" Serafina hesitated, her eyes darting towards Julian, who gave her a look of pure menace. She took a shaky breath. I do," she whispered. "And do you feel you and your husband can provide that stability, given the circumstances of your marriage?" "Yes," she said, her voice barely audible. Mr. Davies paused, then placed a thin file on the witness stand in front of her. "Then can you please explain to the court the documents I have in front of me? These are contracts, signed by you and your husband, retaining one of the country's top surrogacy agencies. They are dated 1 week after your doctors informed you that you could not conceive, and 1 week before, Mr. Croft informed you that he had a biological son he intended to pursue custody of." The courtroom fell utterly silent. Julian went rigid, his knuckles white where he gripped the edge of his table. "Your Honor," Mr. Davies continued, his voice calm and devastating, "the evidence shows that Mr. Croft has not been seeking a son. He has been seeking an heir. When it became clear his wife could not provide one, he did not turn to adoption. He turned to the son he had previously discarded as a loose end. This is not about love. It is about acquisition." "Oh." Serafina stared at the documents, then at her husband's furious, contemptuous face, and something inside her finally broke. The years of emotional neglect, of being a beautiful, strategic asset in his dynastic ambitions, of being valued not for who she was, but for what her womb could, and ultimately could not, provide, it all came to a head. "He told me," she began, her voice trembling but finding a new, clear strength born of final, utter disillusionment. "He told me the child was a mistake, a regrettable chapter from a past life. He told me the mother, Elara, wasn't fit." Her eyes, for the first time, met Elara's across the room, a silent, fleeting acknowledgement of their shared betrayal. "When he found out the boy was living with Silas Thorne, under his protection, he became obsessed," she continued, her voice growing stronger. "It wasn't about fatherhood, it was about winning. He said it was the final piece of his collection, that he would own everything Silas Thorne ever wanted, including the legacy of the man Thorne admired, Arthur Sterling. It was over. The lie, so carefully constructed, was exposed. Julian's masterful performance as the remorseful father lay in ruins, revealing the cold, grasping, narcissistic ambition that lay beneath. He was not a father seeking his son, he was a king seeking to claim a disputed territory, a collector determined to possess a rare and valuable prize. The judge's face was now a mask of cold fury. The reckoning had arrived. Judge Salgado's ruling was not merely a legal decision, it was a scathing indictment. It was delivered not with the dispassionate tone of the court, but with the cold, contained anger of a woman who had seen the truth. She granted Elara sole legal and physical custody, her words affirming Elara's fitness as a mother in every respect. Then she turned her attention to Julian. She spoke of a shocking and callous disregard for the emotional well-being of a child, and of a custody claim filed not out of love, but out of a breathtaking display of ego and narcissistic rivalry. She issued a permanent restraining order forbidding Julian from coming within 500 yards of Leo, Elara, or Thorn Manor. His visitation rights were not just denied, they were suspended indefinitely, pending a psychological evaluation he would almost certainly never agree to. He had not just lost, he had been annihilated, his character dissected and condemned on the legal record for all time. As they left the courthouse, blinking in the sudden, bright sunlight, the battle was over. The media, who had been fed a steady diet of Julian's narrative, were waiting like vultures, but a steely-eyed security team, arranged by Silas, formed a protective phalanx around them, guiding them to a waiting car. Through the throng, Elara saw Julian standing by his own car, alone. Serafina was gone. His lawyers were keeping a respectful distance. He looked diminished, his expensive suit seeming to hang on a frame that had suddenly shrunk. The aura of invincibility, of untouchable power, was gone, stripped away, leaving only a hollow shell of a man. For a long, silent moment, their eyes met across the chaotic space. She saw a flash of disbelief in his gaze, the stunned look of a king who cannot comprehend his own dethronement. And in that moment, Elara felt a nothing. The searing hatred, the agonizing grief, the lingering embers of a love she once thought would last forever, it had all been burned away in the crucible of the past few months. He was simply a stranger, a ghost from a life that was no longer hers. Silas put a protective arm around her shoulder, a gesture of quiet solidarity, and guided her into the car. They drove away, leaving Julian Croft to the ruin of his own making, a king alone in a kingdom that had suddenly lost its meaning. The drive back to Thorn Manor was quiet, but it was a different kind of silence than the one that had haunted them for months. It was the calm, peaceful quiet that follows a storm. The air washed clean. When they arrived, Mrs. Gable was waiting at the door, her face wreathed in a smile of pure, unadulterated relief. The oppressive tension that had held the house in its grip for so long finally dissipated like a fever breaking. Later that evening, after a simple, celebratory dinner of Leo's favorite food, macaroni and cheese, they tucked him into bed. He was oblivious to the monumental battle that had been waged in his name, his world still safe and secure. "Dad?" Leo murmured sleepily from under his covers, his eyes already drifting shut. "Did you win your big meeting today?" Silas sat on the edge of the bed and smoothed the dark hair back from Leo's forehead. His hand, which could command markets and crush competitors, was infinitely gentle. He looked at Elara, who stood in the doorway, and his eyes were full of an emotion too deep for words. "Yes, son," he said, his voice thick. "We won." After Leo was asleep, he and Elara stood in the hallway for a long moment, the quiet peace of the house settling around them like a warm blanket. The weight they had both been carrying for so long had finally been lifted. She reached out and took his hand. It wasn't a gesture of budding romance, but of something deeper, something forged in fire and tested under pressure. It was a gesture of partnership, of profound gratitude, and of a shared, unbreakable bond. They had faced the storm together and had emerged into the calm, not as lovers, but as family. "Thank you, Silas," she said, her voice soft but clear. "For everything. My father, he was right about you." He simply squeezed her hand, his stoic mask finally allowing a faint, weary smile. "He was right about you too," he replied. "You're stronger than you know." And so, the empire built on lies and ambition crumbled, and the family built on love and choice stood stronger than ever. Julian Croft, the king of the concrete jungle, learned the hardest lesson of all, that a child is not a possession to be claimed and a family cannot be acquired through a hostile takeover. He was left with his wealth and his power, a king ruling over a kingdom of ghosts. Elara, Silas, and Leo, in their fortress of tranquility, proved that the truest bonds are not forged by blood, but are chosen with courage, built with sacrifice, and honored by showing up every single day. Their unconventional story became its own kind of legacy, a quiet but powerful fable whispered in the quiet hills upstate, a testament that even in the face of the cruelest betrayal, new beginnings are possible, and sometimes the greatest protector, the truest father, and the most steadfast home come from the most unexpected of places.